Chapter 17 is on human health and environmental risks. It opens with the case study talking about citizen scientists. In Norco, Louisiana, in the old Diamond District, it was surrounded by a chemical plant and an oil refinery. Both were owned by the Shell Oil Company. The people in this town were experiencing higher rates of disease, including higher rates of asthma, cancer, birth defects. So what happened? In 1989, the concerned citizens of Norco were formed by a middle school teacher who wanted answers. Her name was Margie Richard. She started what's referred to as a bucket brigade. They didn't have any data, so they found different points in which they could collect air quality data to start to make a case. The fight against Shell took 13 years. And in 2002, they proved that there was pollutants in their air, and Shell agreed to purchase their homes at a fair price so that people could move, plus $5 million addition for the community for people that chose to live there. In 2007, Shell agreed again that it had violated the air pollution regulations at several Louisiana plants. It was putting at that point 2 million pounds of toxic chemicals into the air. Margie Richards, who started the whole crusade, received the Goldman Environmental Prize. It's proof that one person, she was just a middle school teacher, can make a difference. There's 3 categories of human health risks. One is physical. It includes environmental factors, and these are things like natural disasters, ultraviolet exposure, radon. There's biological, which is associated with disease. A disease is an impaired function to the body with a characteristic set of symptoms, or chemical, due to exposures to chemicals, either natural or synthetic. The leading causes of death in the world are infectious diseases, which are caused by infectious agents, pathogens, pneumonia, STDs, or things like cardiovascular disease or cancer. Most of the diseases, or most of the death in the world, is caused by only 6 different diseases. Respiratory infections, HIV/AIDS, diarrhea, tuberculosis, which is abbreviated TB, malaria, and other childhood diseases. Biological risks are these infectious diseases, and they're caused by infectious agents. So things like pneumonia or STDs, like I said, or things like pathogens, which can be parasitic worms called helminths, as one example. And diseases fall into 2 categories, either chronic or acute. Chronic disease slowly impairs the functioning of a person's body, and things that are chronic are things like heart disease or cancer. And acute diseases rapidly impairs the functioning of a person's body. An example of that would be Ebola. Risk factors for chronic disease, they differ slightly between low-income countries and highly developed countries. In low-income countries or less developed countries, things like poverty, and in highly developed countries, lifestyle choices play into what these risks are. So if you look at the 2 different charts that we have below, the low-income countries, you're looking at things like low birth weight, high blood pressure, unsafe sex, sanitation, hygiene, indoor smoke from using solid fuels indoors, and then getting into tobacco use. If you look at high-income countries, number 1 by a lot is tobacco use and high blood pressure, obesity, physical inactivity, blood glucose. So while there's some overlap, it's definitely very different depending on which sort of country that you're in. Low-income countries looked at things like unsafe water and sanitation and malnutrition. And things like improved nutrition would allow for better overall health. And whereas high-income countries look at tobacco and a less active lifestyle. If we start looking at an epidemic is when a pathogen causes a rapid increase in disease, whereas a pandemic is an epidemic that occurs over a large geographic region, something like a continent. If we look at some historically important diseases, we can look at things like plague. It's the one that's the most familiar. It's a bacteria that's carried by fleas. The symptoms are swollen glands, black spots on the skin, extreme pain, killed hundreds of millions of people, including a quarter of the people of Europe in the 1300s. The last major outbreak was in the 1900s in Asia. It can be cured by antibiotics most of the time. Malaria killed millions so far. It's a parasite that's in mosquitoes. It caused recurrent flu-like symptoms, and 350 to 500 million people catch malaria, and about 1 million will die. Most of them are children. That's one of the big reasons that DDT became so popular. And then tuberculosis, which is often abbreviated TB. It's a bacterial in the lungs. The symptom is coughing. You can be weak, night sweats. You start to cough up blood. A third of the world is infected, but symptomless. And then 9 million people will develop TB, and 2 million people will die. It's treated with antibiotics, but drug-resistant tuberculosis is starting to develop. Emerging infectious diseases are infectious diseases that were not previously described for the past 20 years. Since 1970, we've had about one a year. Most of the time, they are pathogens that have infected animals that have moved to humans. The main examples of these are HIV/AIDS. It started in the 1970s is when we noticed that it was spread by sexual contact and IV drug users. In 2006, a very similar disease was discovered in chimps. Since then, 33 million people are infected and 25 million have died. Ebola, hemorrhagic fever, in 1976, it was discovered in the Congo near the Ebola River. Not an epidemic, but it's highly fatal. The symptoms are fever, vomiting, and internal and external bleeding. Death occurs within 2 weeks, and there's no drugs against it. Mad cow disease, it was discovered in the 1980s. It's a neurological disease. The cows, they lose their coordination and then they die. Prions, proteins in the brain, mutate and they're not destroyed by cooking. So it was transmitted by cows being fed ground up remains of other cows. It's now illegal to do, and that's how it would spread. Bird flu. Flu is normally H1N1, but in 2006, a flu strain H5N1 jumped from birds to people. There's no defenses, and as of 2003, about 700 people were infected. The government response is to euthanize birds, but it is not spread person to person. It has to be bird to person. And the last one is the West Nile virus. It lives in hundreds of species of birds, and it's transmitted among birds by mosquitoes. It's lethal to crows, blue jays, and robins, and then sometimes it transmits to humans or to horses. For humans, it's the inflammation of the brain, and then it leads to illness, sometimes death. In 1999, it was in New York, and it spread through the United States quickly. The highest years of deaths were in 2002 and 2003. Mosquito controls have largely regulated West Nile virus. Some of the reasons we have emergence and reemergence is the evolution of disease, so it can move to a human host. Some diseases become antibiotic resistant. Urbanization, overcrowding, when you have more people in the same space, it's easier to spread. An increased population of elderly, which are susceptible to disease. Pollution and environmental degradation, more pollution make people weaker to it. Growth in international travel, so things can spread when people are traveling from country to country. Poverty and social inequality. There's various ways that humans are infected. It seems sort of obvious, either from other people, either from animals, from the water they drink, from the air they breathe, from the food they eat, or from wild animals. In order to combat disease in lesser developed countries, things like improving nutrition, availability of clean drinking water, improving sanitation, education, and rapid response plans to combat emerging diseases. In highly developed countries, we want to promote healthier lifestyle choices, increase our physical activity, eat balanced diet, limit excess food consumption, limit tobacco use, continue education, and development of rapid response plans. We move to chemical risks. It's broken into some different categories. Toxicology is the study of chemical risks. So these are things like pharmaceuticals, insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides. The different categories are things like neurotoxins, which are chemicals that disrupt the nervous system of animals. Insecticides are a big example of that. Lead and mercury are prime examples of elements that do that, and insects are highly sensitive to neurotoxins. Carcinogens are chemicals that cause cancer. They cause cell damage, and they lead to uncontrolled growth of these cells. A lot of times it's mutagens, which cause damage to the genetic materials. Well-known carcinogens are things like asbestos, radon, formaldehyde, and tobacco. Teratogens are chemicals that interfere with the normal development of embryos or fetuses. The most famous example is thalidomide, which was given for morning sickness. It was given to thousands of women in the United States, and it led to severe birth defects. Another example is alcohol. Allergens are chemicals that cause allergic reactions. It causes an abnormally high response from the immune system. Common allergens are peanuts, milk, penicillin, and codeine. And the last one is endocrine disruptors. They are chemicals that interfere with the normal functioning of hormones in an animal's body. For example, wastewater from animal rearing facilities, and hormones from human birth control, and pesticides that mimic animal hormones. These are all different things that can be endocrine disruptors. And these are some chemicals of major concern. So we can see them broken into these categories of neurotoxin, carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, etc. Looking at dose-response studies. A dose-response studies is what we want to do is expose plants or animals to different amounts of chemicals and observe various responses, including death, changes in behavior, or changes in reproduction. It can be a concentration or a dose. So we can have a LD50, which can be used to compare the toxicity of chemicals, or the ED50, which is the effective dose that causes 50% of the animals to display the harmful but non-lethal effect. When we are looking for a safe concentration, we often take the LD50 of what's found to be in rats, and it's extrapolated to humans, and then often divided by 10. But when we're looking at people, we take the LD50 for rats and divide it by 1,000. So we really err on the side of caution when we announce that LD50 for people. Effects of chemicals in the U.S. are regulated by the EPA under the Substance Control Act of 1976. So the EPA can regulate chemicals. This excludes food, cosmetics, and pesticides. Testing is done on only a few species. So we only really look at, if we're looking to compare things for mammals and humans, we use mice and rats. For birds, we typically use pigeons or quail. For fish, we use trout. For invertebrates, we use water fleas. But what we are looking for is whatever the most sensitive organism is. And so we'll choose that. Testing is not often done on amphibians and reptiles, and they are often considered to be some of the most fragile organisms because they live in both aquatic and terrestrial environments. And when we're looking for these safe concentrations, we look at that LD50, like I said, we extrapolate the results to humans, but then we go ahead and divide that result by 1,000 to make sure we have extra room to be safe. If we're looking at some different terminology, epidemiology is the field of science that strives to understand the causes of illness and the disease in humans and wildlife populations. If we're going to do a retrospective study, we're going to monitor people who have been exposed to a chemical in the past compared to a group not exposed. So something like the chemical exposure that happened in Bhopal, India, from the Union Carbide releasing a whole bunch of gas. So we looked at the people that were exposed compared to people that weren't exposed. A prospective study monitors people who might be exposed to chemicals in the future. So you might pick 1,000 people and have them keep track of their alcohol and tobacco use. Synergistic interactions is when two risks come together and cause more harm than the one alone would. Ways to be exposed, we sort of spoke this before, but through water, through air, through food, through soil, and then unborn children can be exposed. Solubility is how well chemicals dissolved in a liquid, and that's significant because that's one of the main ways that we can be exposed to chemicals.